In the ongoing prisoner exchange between Hamas and the government of Israel, over 80 hostages that Hamas had taken on October 7th have been released. Recent statements, broken by NBC from Hamas, have said that 3 of the hostages that they had taken on October 7th were killed in the IDF bombing campaign of Gaza, that at this point has taken an estimated 20,000 civilian lives per the Euromed. NBC first broke this story today on October 29th, 2023. This is the report.
So, Morgan, earlier today, Hamas saying that the youngest Israeli hostage, 10-month-old baby named Kafir, along with his older brother, 4-year-old named Ariel, and their mother, died in Gaza. They say that they were killed by Israeli airstrikes sometime before this truce began. Now, NBC News is not able to independently verify that claim, and nor at this point is the Israeli military confirming it. They're saying they are examining this claim made by Hamas. They say they have spoken to the family. They are keeping them updated on everything they know. If this news is true, it is heartbreaking. It is an extraordinary blow to this family who had their hopes up that these 2 little boys, that their mother would be coming out under this current deal, which was for women, for children. We have seen enormous rallies here in Israel for this family. They have really become kind of symbols of the hostage movement here. So people waiting with bated breath, hoping that this claim by Hamas is proven not to be true.
Now, one thing I'd like to note is that during that report, the NBC correspondent in Tel Aviv noted that the families of the hostages have seen these 3 that unfortunately have died as a sort of symbol for their family's release, and for their movement to have these hostages returned home. And clearly no one wants any hostages to die. But one thing that NBC correspondents did not note is that this is also devastating towards the Israeli narrative, that these are targeted strikes, that these are simply to go after Hamas. And while it's no surprise that the IDF would not consider for a moment the lives of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, it is, going without saying, going to risk the lives of those hostages during this bombing campaign, and has been an open question as to whether or not those bombs have affected any of the hostages. Right now, the only way for us to know for sure that the bombing campaign killed these 3 hostages is for an independent investigation to take place. Whether or not that's going to actually happen is an open question. The IDF and the U.S. have stood in the way of independent investigations, not just for the entire history of Israel, but also for the entirety of the bombing campaign since the 7th. It's been an open question about the treatment of the Hamas hostages during their captivity in Gaza. Multiple statements have come out from the families, and one Livshitz, the elderly Israeli woman who was released in the initial hostage release by Hamas. Whether or not these statements are accurate, whether or not they're coerced, and, of course, cynical weaponization of pseudoscientific terminology like Stockholm Syndrome or brainwashing have been used for these hostages. A letter supposedly left for Hamas by one of the hostages was released, and while I'm not going to say that it is a real letter, there's no way to confirm it, and while Israel is keeping the families quiet and giving them media training before they're allowed to speak to the press, which does raise questions about what Israel's intentions are with giving them media training, it's an open question as to whether or not the treatment of the hostages, as have been reported, is true. What is not questioned, what is never brought up, are the treatment of Palestinians taken to prison by Israel. Israel has a long history of taking random Palestinian men, women, children, workers off the streets of the West Bank and Gaza and putting them in indefinite detention, where they're not subject to a jury of their peers, a fair trial, counsel, or anything that would resemble a legitimate court system. One of the hostages taken, who was 16 at the time, was accused of a knife attack, despite no evidence and the family rejecting the claims of the IDF, was held for over 8 years. The system of Israeli imprisonment of Palestinians goes well beyond simply the kangaroo courts, as some have described them. Done in a military tribunal, these Palestinians are subjected to untold abuse, beyond even their own lifetime. If the claims by Hamas are true, and are verified by an independent outlet, then it would be an indictment of the entire Israeli bombing campaign. We've already seen that these airstrikes have killed over 80 UN workers. A report from Reuters reads UN mourns record death toll in war with over 100 employees killed in Gaza. More than 100 United Nations employees have been killed since the Israel-Hamas war began in Gaza. The UN Palestinian refugee camp, the UNRWA, said on Friday, making it the deadliest conflict ever for the UN in such a short period of time. Some were killed queuing for bread. Others died along with their families in their homes, the UNRWA told Reuters, as Israel's devastating aerial ground war against Hamas in densely populated Gaza continued in response to the October 7th cross-border assault on Israel. In addition to UN employees, over 60 journalists, an assault directly on the press and their families has taken place. Per the Committee to Protect Journalists, as of November 29th, 57 journalists and media workers were confirmed dead, 50 Palestinian, 4 Israeli, and 3 Lebanese. 11 journalists were reported injured, 3 journalists were reported missing, and 19 journalists were reported arrested. Only democracy in the Middle East, though, most moral army. It comes as a surprise to absolutely no one that these bombing campaigns were indiscriminate, and in the case of journalists and UN facilities, very discriminate. So that these bombing campaigns would also affect the hostages that were taken by the IDF, but that it would also affect the hostages taken by Hamas, I don't think would shock anyone. To discuss the treatment of Palestinians within IDF prisons, this from Jacobin. The grim reality of Israel's corpse politics. The Jacobin investigation explores Israel's practice of using the bodies of slain Palestinians as bargaining chips, refusing to return them to their families, denying the right to bury loved ones. This policy inflicts the anguish of mourning without closure. After Israeli forces shot and killed 39-year-old Fadi Samara in May of 2020, his mourning family dug him a grave in his village of Abu Kash, located in the occupied West Bank district of Ramallah. But nearly 4 years later, his grave remains empty. Quote, I take the children to their father's grave a few times a month, even though we still have not received his body, says Saja Mohammed, Samara's 31-year-old widow and mother of his 5 children, ages 9 to 3. It gives the children some comfort, she continues, sitting on the couch at her family's home in the city of Bidya, in the northern Salfit district, where she returned following Samara's killing. Quote, we live with the hope that one day his body will be returned to us, and when that day comes, his grave is ready to receive him. Samara's body is one of hundreds currently held by Israel, part of a decades-long policy that researchers and rights groups described as an attempt to control and punish Palestinian families by withholding the corpses of their slain loved ones. Some are buried in nameless graves, and others are frozen in refrigerators. Israeli officials claim this controversial practice is necessary to avoid incitement during funerals of Palestinians killed by Israelis. Israel also withholds the remains of slain Palestinians who are suspected of having carried out attacks against Israelis, using their corpses as bargaining chips for future negotiations with Palestinian leaders. However, Palestinians, some of whom have waited for months, years, and in some cases decades for the return of their slain loved ones' bodies, argue that this policy aims to punish them, condemning their lives to perpetual mourning. Israel is the only country in the world that has a policy of confiscating and withholding human remains, which is a violation of international humanitarian and human rights law. Even in death, Palestinians are not allowed to mourn. And one of the most insidious parts of the ongoing siege on Gaza and the increased raids on the West Bank, where over 1,000 Palestinians have been arrested and nearly 200 have been killed by the IDF since October 7th, is that all of this bloodshed in response to what happened has not even allowed Israelis to mourn, to properly grieve and process what happened to them. Just as in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, America did not allow Americans to process their grief. This is not how healing is done. It is collective punishment. Even in death, Palestinians who have not been charged in a legitimate court on trumped-up charges to rest even in death. And beyond these prison fridges, as they're called by human rights organizations, the treatment of many graphic descriptions of what happened to Israelis at the kibbutzim on October 7th and the possible treatment of hostages since October 7th has been made by Israeli correspondents, officials, and even the president and prime minister of Israel. Graphic descriptions of sexual assault, of brutalizing and torture have been made, despite no evidence of that happening so far. The hypocrisy that Israel would say that Hamas are barbaric in their treatment of their prisoners is not lost upon those who have been familiar with this subject for more than the 2 months since October 7th. Instances of sexual assault are rampant within Palestinian prisons. This from CARE, the Committee on Arab American and Islamic Relations. Israeli guards rape Palestinian women. A Palestinian female freed from Israeli detention said more than 15 fellow Palestinian women were raped by Israeli interrogators who forced them to confess to charges leveled against them and collaborate with Israeli intelligence. Israeli investigators and intelligence officers keep videotapes of the raping to blackmail the female detainees. She asserted that this technique has been used for years by Israeli interrogators against Palestinian detainees. They have used this raping techniques before my detention and continue to use it until today, said the Palestinian woman who spent 9 years of her life in Israeli detention. Anyone familiar with the war on terror and what happens at Guantanamo Bay could not be surprised by this. Israel, after all, is a vassal state of the United States and a testing ground for the police state and imperialist endeavors that can be done on poor people, particularly those who are a threat to U.S. and Israeli narrative. To go even further, and when I first read about this, I will admit, it did sound like a conspiracy theory or an anti-Semitic canard, but further research shows that it is indeed a regular practice of the Israeli government, that being the stealing of organs from Palestinian prisoners and dead Palestinians killed by the IDF.
איברים לבנק האור של מדינת ישראל, שהוא בעצם היה בנק האור של צה"ל, אבל מחיילים לא לקחו. לא נוגעים, משאירים שלם את החייל, מאוד חשוב, אבל לוקחים מאחרים. מי? אז עכשיו השאלה מי, ותדמיינו ממי לוקחים. בתקופות מסוימות לקחו מפלסטינאים, ואחר כך זה היה עולים חדשים, עובדים זרים.
נלקחו רקמות דברים מגופות שעברו נתיחה, וזה לא היה משנה אם מדובר בתושבי ישראל, או עובדים זרים או פלסטינים.
זה נחשב בנק גדול ביחס לעולם?
זה הכי גדול בעולם.
הכי גדול בעולם?
כן.
מה אחוז התרומות ביחס לאנשים בישראל? כלומר, איזה אחוז...
למה צוחקת?
כי זו שאלה מאוד מוזרה. אני לא יכולה להגיד לך, הוא כל כך קטן.
זו שאלה לא מוזרה, תשובה מוזרה.
תשובה מוזרה. לא, התשובה לא מוזרה. משום שלא תורמים.
That was an investigative report from Mint Press News back in 2001. When I first heard about this, I had to believe that it was made up, that it was fabricated in order to foment anti-Semitic narratives about the Israeli government. But multiple reports have shown that this is a regular practice. The largest skin bank in the world. And Israelis donate at such low rates that they don't even count them. It's all Palestinians. To think that you would not have rights in your movement, in where you live, to collect rainwater, but also rights to your own body. We talk about bodily autonomy in America in regards to reproductive rights, but the rights to your organs, to the rights to your corpse, are sacrosanct. You, as an American in a democracy, have the right to withhold your organs upon your death as an organ donor. You can choose not to do that, and no one can force your body after death to donate your organs. But Palestinians don't have that right. Every time I have heard an Israeli official make a statement on what exactly it is that Hamas does, or the threat to Israel by Palestinians, it's all a confession. Every accusation is a confession. And I know what you're thinking. Well, how is Israel supposed to get these hostages without sympathy from the public? The public already has sympathy. The public already has sympathy in the wake of a terrorist attack for those hostages. No one wants hostages to be taken. But where's the sympathy for the Palestinian hostages? Because they're not prisoners. Prisoners would suggest that they committed a crime. A statement from Jeremy Scahill, co-founder of The Intercept, shows that of the 300 names, 270 were children, 30 were women, 233 had not been convicted of anything, and 21 are accused of throwing stones. In a recent anti-Islamic screed that Ben Shapiro posted on his channel, he raised an unsighted chart that broke down what exactly these charges were. I'll save you from having to listen to Ben Shapiro's voice and simply show you the chart that he posted. Of those 300 names, these are the accusations. 15% threw stones, 11.7% other, 12% Molotov cocktails, 10% explosives, 14% a terrorist attempt, 11% a terrorist contact, 6.4% other violences, 10% a shooting attack, and 8% a stabbing attack. Now, my question that I have is, why are other violences and other separated from one another? What would make these two separate from one another? What is other? What are other violences? And throwing stones is a ridiculous notion, considering that the level of disproportionate capacity for violence is very apparent. And terrorist contact is an interesting way of saying that you know somebody who could possibly be associated with a terrorist organization, especially considering that the IDF considers all Palestinians terrorists. Don't ask me, ask Yoav Gallant.
A war against Hamas is a comprehensive all-out war until a full victory, and it includes all Hamas operatives from the very senior ones to the very lowest level ones. For me, there is no difference between a terrorist with AK-47 and fatigues and a terrorist who wears a three-piece suit and travels elsewhere in the world. They should all die.
Now, I'm not one to throw around accusations of evil. Things are always more complicated than that. But I don't know how else you would describe that look, other than utter contempt for the existence of Arabs, of Palestinians, of Muslims. I don't know how else you describe that. I tell you all of this. I try and provide the full context of the experience of these hostages, which is what they are, hostages that Israel is holding for the express purpose of creating an environment of subjugation, and for when these instances happen, where there are hostages, they are fodder for political gain. I tell you all of this, not to justify what happened at the kibbutz, not to say that Hamas is correct in their actions, but to provide a simple glimpse into the existence and ask, how far could you be pushed before you push back? And Israel has pushed Palestinians, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, beyond human capacity, beyond what anyone would be expected to tolerate. If Israel wants an end to this, Israel wants an end to Hamas, then Israel must want an end to the apartheid state of Israel. If you stuck around until the end of this video, I hope you learned a few things, I hope you felt informed, and I hope that you subscribe to this channel. If you like this kind of coverage, if you enjoy the sultry sounds of my voice, then follow me on twitch.tv/Gremloe, where I'm live every day at 7 a.m., covering a variety of topics. Lately, it's been a lot of Palestine. And consider subscribing there as well. Thank you for watching.